Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on clinical study report considerations for studies disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Stacy Teagan. I'm with the Transcelerate Biopharma Inc. I'm a senior program manager here at Transcelerate. On the next slide, you'll also see we have Vash Krishna on. He is our project manager for the workstream clinical content and reuse that came up with this tool. Also on today, we have our expert presenters. We have Jenny Beeks-Reed, who was with Amgen as the executive director for their global regulatory and R&D policy group. Jenny's a key representative for the Transcelerate Regulatory Council. And we have Ivan Walrath from Pfizer, who is their head of audit and inspection quality. Ivan was a key contributor to this effort. Just a few logistics before we get started. If you've not used the GoToWebinar technology before, you can control your view with this pane on the right. The little arrow will pop out the pane to give you a bit more control. And I do want to call out the questions pane. Throughout the webinar today, you can enter your questions here for our panelists. We'll save those for the Q&A session at the end. I do also want to note that this webinar will be recorded in whole or in part today. And if you do not consent to being recorded, you can note that in the questions panel now. We hope to have an interactive session for you today, and thus we'll be including some polling. I'm going to run a bit of a poll now to test that out. I do want to mention that this is voluntary. All polls are going to be anonymous, so feel free to participate if you like. Feel free to abstain. And with that, we'll do a quick test on what is your favorite color. Okay, so today we're looking for your favorite color. Is it orange? Here we like at Transcelerate with our branding, red, green, or blue. Looks like we have about great audience participation. Oh, all the way up to 70% of our audience. We have a great engaged audience today. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share our results. Okay, it seems we have big fans of blue, but a good variety on the other colors as well. Thank you all for participating in that. We will have a few polls throughout the webinar today to help us all get the most out of this experience. Just a few ground rules. At Transcelerate, we wanted to share that participation in Transcelerate initiatives from our member companies is voluntary, as is the adoption of our assets and tools. Because we are a nonprofit collaboration in this space, we do refrain from discussing things like vendors, sites, CROs, long-term portfolio planning, pricing models, vendors, etc. So we would ask that you avoid any questions on those topics today. Okay, our agenda. I'll give you just a brief overview of Transcelerate and the clinical content and reuse team, and then we'll get to the important stuff where we'll go into some background and approach on this project that came up with these considerations. We'll go through the guiding principles that we use, key considerations and sample tests for you to consider as you're reporting on studies that were disrupted by the pandemic. We will leave time for questions and answers, so please feel free to enter those questions in the questions pane throughout the session. Now, just a bit of background on Transcelerate. As I mentioned, we are a not-for-profit entity created to foster collaboration among the biopharmaceutical space, really with a shared goal of just making life better for patients. Transcelerate was created in 2012 with just 10 member companies and 5 initiatives, and today we have 20 member companies and over 30 initiatives. And the goal of Transcelerate is to the rising tide raises all boats, so we try to post all of our learnings, our assets, our tools on our public website to be accessible for anyone across industry. Now, just a bit about the clinical content and reuse team. This project started in 2014 with the initial goal of creating a common protocol template. There was an unmet need around the way information is organized and communicated. They came together and created not just a common protocol template, but also an SAP and CSR template. And this is to bring value across industry, across different stakeholders, putting the same information in the same place and enabling reuse of this information so that folks like sites and regulators can focus in on the information they need quickly. All right, now as we get in, we'll do a couple of polls to gauge our audience. The question for you all is, have you read the CSR considerations document? We're all very busy, just trying to baseline a little bit of where our audience is coming from as we talk through this tool for you today. This will help us better to articulate maybe some of the highlights in it, or maybe if we need to go deeper into the content and questions for you all. Okay, go ahead and close the poll and share out the results. All right, so we have a good split across our audience today. A quarter of you have read it, 46% have not, so this is a great opportunity to learn, and a third, 30% have skimmed it. So we'll be able to get a little bit deeper for you today so that you'll know if it's worth a full-on read. We'll hide that poll. We have another poll here around how useful it will be. So how useful do you think the CSR considerations document will be for you as you process and report on these studies that were disrupted by COVID? Give you all a minute to think through. If you're not sure that it would be useful, you've already assessed that it will be very useful, or if you're perhaps going to wait till the webinar to make that call. Okay, wrap this up and share out results. Okay, well, I'm pleased to see that 63% of you are feeling that it will be very useful. I think the team is also of that mindset, and we're able to come together and with that goal of providing useful tool to you. So thank you for that. We hope to fulfill that. Okay, and with that, I will stop my talking and pass on to Jenny Beeks-Reed. Jenny is our expert on the regulatory side, and she will go over the background and approach that the team used. Jenny?
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, well, I'm very happy to be here with you today, and as Stacy said, I'll briefly cover the background and Trancelerate's approach to developing this tool. We all know that a few months ago, it's been a crazy few months, we had a lot of challenge to our clinical development programs because of the pandemic. Those challenges, just to name a few, were enrollment in our studies, collecting different data points and measurements, getting supplies to our participants or to sites, and frankly, some missing data and some implications or different sources of data and some of the implications that may have with respect to potential new biases in the data set that we provide to the regulators. So during this time, as everyone I'm sure is quite aware, the regulators globally were really trying to help the clinical community by publishing a lot of guidance. And that was very helpful, whether it's an initial guidance and follow-up with Q&As as the situation continued to develop, or another, additional documents. But that guidance was particularly helpful. There's some ambiguities in it, which we tried to address and understand, but we were using those guidance documents to help to think about how we can provide information back to the regulators to help them understand how we coped with this pandemic. And as Stacy said, we already had a lot of experts that were working on some of these other tools that then we could work with to develop this tool. Very fast-moving environment it's been these last several months. Lots of stakeholders involved, everyone trying to grapple with the best way to continue the clinical development enterprise, really. We had a lot riding on this, a lot of participants who need products. We need to continue to develop products and get approvals to provide patients with access at the end of the day. A lot of different parties that we've identified some below that we needed to engage with or inform, such as the health authorities and regulators. Let them know what we're trying to develop in terms of tools, and also aligning with other external stakeholders in the endeavor of trying to have sharing best practices, understanding that we all are in this together and we want to work together to try to develop an understanding of each other's perspectives, and then develop the best tool possible. We had a big goal, looking at how do we describe our studies? How do we describe the effect of this pandemic? Sometimes a big effect, sometimes not as big effect, but how do we tell that story in a meaningful way so that we all have, these tools are publicly available. It's not just for the member companies. This is nonprofit organization, as Stacy said. So we were looking at this to say, how can we provide value in this current situation to, companies, to stakeholders, to, other regulators and other stakeholders, and sharing our insights, best practices, and then trying to deliver a tool that could incorporate that thinking and hopefully be helpful. We had 19 member companies who participated in the initiative. From those 19 companies, about 50 people worked on this initiative that spanned 10 countries, and we came up with the 3 deliverables of the guiding principles that you'll hear Ivan talk about, as well as key considerations and sample text. We had a core team that worked, met very frequently and had a lot of work product that we're constantly generating and refining. Part of that refinement process was bringing in additional experts from our companies from varied disciplines, but very important. This document covers a lot of different content that is owned or developed by people in different parts of the company. So our scientists, our safety folks, statisticians, and data scientists, very importantly, regulatory experts, and like I've mentioned earlier, we already have some experts within the member companies that have been working on some of these tools. I'm a member, as Stacy mentioned, of the Transaccelerates Regulatory Council. So we were looking at this from both a regulatory perspective, but also thinking about how do we engage with health authorities just to let them know this tool is out there. If we've got input, that's great. Regardless, the goal is to try to develop a product, a CSR, that describes our situation and the impact of our studies of this pandemic as clearly as possible to help us all come to a good understanding of what the results mean at the end of the day. And I think importantly, what we were always focusing on with all of what's going on with clinical development is participant safety and making sure that we have the data of the utmost integrity so that we can, we deliver as much as, our normal content as possible, which takes those 2 major considerations into account. Next slide, please. These are our 3 deliverables that Ivan will go into with in more detail. Basically, those guiding principles, which I just mentioned a couple of them that are really key to everything that we were looking at. Key considerations: what are the key points that CSR should be addressing and not addressing? And then some sample text. These are not prescriptive. Transaccelerate is not developing a guidance document. That's the health authority. This is a tool to help those developing a CSR think through what could be and what should be, in our views, considered to be in a document to help tell that story of our journey through the clinical development enterprise as well as possible. With that, I'll turn it over to Ivan.
Thanks, Ginny, and for the background and update there. And I'm going to walk through our deliverables. So, like Ginny was saying, the team worked through 5 guiding principles. Okay, we wanted to tell the story, be forthcoming, establish the right emphasis, allowing for the subsequent learning. And then also reiterating something Ginny said, not everything needs to be in the CSR. So around telling the story is developing a summary of impact. So the idea here is being able to walk the reviewer through the story of the pandemic as it played out in your specific trial. And for the participants in your trial. Being able to provide a description of the impact and any mitigations that were taken, any actions taken to mitigate disruption. There are two, basically we came up with two reporting scenarios. One for a failed or terminated study. And in that scenario, the pandemic is really the featured discussion of the report. And the second is a study that does complete with conclusions. And in that scenario, the pandemic is not the featured discussion, but it is an element that will get covered. Often the full implications of the study sometimes can't be appreciated until the development program is completed. So there are some implications there. And then really emphasizing not everything needs to go into the CSR. Things that were done as part of normal practice or as established plans don't need to go in the CSR. The idea here is that the things that were disrupted or things that were different as a result of the disruption. So using that as a principle. We could go ahead and advance, please. So the summary of impact, really answering the question, how and to what degree was the study affected by COVID-19? So some very basic questions. What was the status of the trial when the disruption began? Had it started? Were you in recruitment? Were you in conduct phase? Were you in reporting? And then what steps were taken, excuse me, to minimize the impact to the trial? Were there protocol amendments? Any amendments to the statistical analysis plan, to monitoring plans? Were there any pauses to enrollments or interruptions in dosing? And if there were those interruptions, restarts? And then any other additional mitigations that were taken? Direct impact on participants, withdrawals, or any other dispositions due to illness or resulting from the disruption, and a by patient listing of impacts on those participants. And finally, was the trial able to complete, and could you draw conclusions from the study on the primary and key secondary endpoints, notwithstanding any of the disruptions? A key element of of that summary of the impact. We could go ahead and advance, please. So, looking at the results, there's a high risk of missing data. So, what was the impact of that? Certainly, statisticians will have been watching this very closely. The trial may have been amended to allow for example, extended visit windows, modification of endpoints, any particular strategy for the study for handling intercurrent events, or any sensitivity analyses. So important to cover those. Any new potential for bias. So some mitigations, though necessary, say for example, to protect the rights of participants, may have introduced the possibility of bias that wasn't previously an issue. That would be an important element to cover. And the CSR should really comment on these situations and discuss any measures that are taken or that were taken to minimize the bias, as well as the rationale for acceptability of the data nonetheless. And then certainly with safety, starting with the standard analyses, and and then consider if there were any post hoc analyses that were done, the right time and optimal context to report on those. The item in gray on the subgroup analyses, this was something that was previously mentioned in regulatory guidance and has which has been removed from regulatory guidance. So you can see the environment here related to the handling of the pandemic is rapidly evolving. So we've left it in the materials so for awareness that this was a a consideration from the guidance, but again, it has subsequently been removed, so we've graded out. Can we advance, please? So the sample text. So what is it going to do for us? Sample text is going to give some ideas on how to present the discussion of the topics that may be relevant for your study. They're going to offer some sample text for some scenarios on the same subject. For example, a heavily impacted study versus a minimally impacted study. They need to be, the text is not intended for cut and paste. It needs to be tailored to fit the situation in your particular study with your particular conventions for CSR reporting. What the sample text will not do, it's not going to dictate the level of detail that is appropriate for each situation. It's very much dependent on the specific situation in the study, as well as the norms for your company. It's not going to dictate where to place discussions. So if we think about from the beginning in terms of having the report tell the story, making that decision is certainly going to be an individual company and report decision on the best place to place those discussions. And it's not going to be all encompassing. So it will not have all the passages of text that you might need, but should give some good flavors and some good ingredients. So if we could go ahead and advance, Janet. So in terms of looking at the considerations in sample language, so here's essentially a screenshot. So thinking first around the chronology of events and describing any impacts of the pandemic here, reading down the left, had to the continuity of the trial, terminations, pauses, and restarting. Again, any sites, any countries, or the trial terminated, the factors that went around the decision. Were there any pauses due to the pandemic? Again, how was that decision made? What were the factors? What were the risk factors that were considered in making that decision? And then treatment administration. Was it either amended for any participants or paused? And then if paused, was it restarted? And then very similar, how was that decision made and what factors were considered and how did it play out? And then certainly reviewing any amendments to the protocol or the analysis plan and describing the status of the trial at the time of those amendments. So for example, did you put in a data monitoring committee or was there one in place and was there an impact? And how was that utilized during the pandemic? And where was recruitment a key element there? And then certainly, was the trial able to meet its objectives? In the impact summary, this is only a high level statement. And then here there on the right, you can see the beginnings of some sample text in terms of some language that can be used in terms of, okay, there's the start and stops, the completion of the trial, the level of disruption, and then some if-thens. So if the trial was minimally impacted and beginning to describe that. So it's just a flavor of the deliverable and what you'll see for each of the sections. Okay, we could move on. So I think we have a poll question coming up. So
we do, Edwin. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. So we have a poll question coming up and I will launch it now. Great, so the question for our audience, have you worked on a CSR for a study impacted by the pandemic? Maybe we'll add yet to that. So option 1, yes, directly. 2, yes, in a consulting capacity. Not yet, but I will. And finally, no, I do not plan to. So we'll give folks in our audience a chance to submit that. Good participation. 10 more seconds and we'll close it. All right, let me share out the results. I see a lot of impact to come. So hopefully this webinar and this tool is coming at a timely place for you all. There have been 15% that have already worked on it directly and 9% in a consulting capacity, but we can see the vast majority, 62%, see it coming in their future. So thank you for that. Good to know. And then we have another poll. Let me hide this one and we'll go to our next poll. If you have worked on a CSR for a study impacted, we'd love to hear how severely impacted was your study. Again, this is anonymous. Just want to remind folks that this is anonymous. Option might be that the study actually was failed or terminated. What we found, have some tips in the tools document on how to handle that. The study was completed with some impact, or perhaps the study was completed with minor or even no impact. Looks like some votes are still coming in. I think everyone's probably very curious about the experience we can tap within this audience. So we'll give another few seconds to get answers in. Really appreciate those who have that experience sharing it. I'm gonna go ahead and close the poll and share out our results. So for those who were impacted, only 1% where the study was really terminated. 33% had some impact, and great to hear that 66% of those studies were able to be completed with only minor or no impacts. So, you know, of course, this is a poll and a webinar, and perhaps those studies were almost done and lots of information, but it's always good to just have that sharing of experience. We appreciate your participation there. Go back to the slides. I believe I've closed the poll. And if we're able to go back to the slides. Thank you. All right, well, now we will turn our attention to the question and answer portion of the webinar.